The Dowager Duchess of Calverton laid a folded banknote on the carriage seat between them and said, "You are not here to be liked, Miss Allenby. You are here to be impossible." Beatrice Allenby picked up the note, turned it over, and read the sum twice to be certain she had not invented a naught out of hope. She had not. It was the largest amount of money she had ever held in her gloved hand, and it had been offered to her for the express purpose of being unbearable to a duke. "You wish me to fail," she said. "I wish you to repel." The Dowager arranged her own gloves, a finger at a time, smoothing each seam as though the carriage and everything in it answered to her. "My son has taken it into his head that he will marry where his heart leads. He calls it conviction. I call it a fever, and fevers break when you show the patient the worst of what he claims to want. You, Miss Allenby, are the worst of what he claims to want. A rector's daughter from a parish I cannot find on a decent map. No fortune, no connections worth the ink. And, I am given to understand, a tongue that has cost you 3 positions in 4 years. 4 positions, B said. You have undercounted me. Most people overcount. Something moved at the corner of the Dowager's mouth, and was suppressed before it could become anything. You will come to Calverton as a candidate for his hand. You will be charming in all the wrong ways. You will be clever where cleverness is unwelcome, and honest where honesty is fatal. And when my son has looked at you for a fortnight and recoiled from the future you represent, he will be cured, and you will leave richer than your father has been in his life. Are we agreed?" The horses leaned into the hill. The wheels found every rut in the rough road, and the cold leather of the seat jolted hard against Bee's spine. Spring light came green and unsteady through the carriage window, dust turning gold in the slant of it, and over the smell of the Dowager's scent, something dry and expensive like cold silver. Bee thought about her father's study, where the rain had begun to come through the ceiling above the desk, and where he sat reading Greek to the leak, as though it were a parishioner who might be persuaded. She thought about the sum in her hand. She thought, too, about the thing the Dowager had said, and the thing the Dowager had not said, which were not the same thing, and which a less careful listener would have heard as one. "We are agreed," B said, and folded the note away. "On the terms you have spoken. Not, I think, on the terms you mean." The Dowager's gaze sharpened. "And what do you imagine I mean?" "I haven't decided yet," said B. "When I do, you'll be the second to know." Calverton House came up out of its park like a thing that had been told, once, that it was magnificent, and had never since had cause to doubt it. B counted the windows on the south front as the carriage drew round. She counted things when she was nervous, and she was always nervous, though no living person had ever caught her at it, and reached 41 before a footman opened the door and the counting became impossible. She was shown up a staircase wide enough to drive sheep along, and into a room hung with green silk, where a small fire burned without warming the cold corners, and the air smelled of beeswax and old stone. And there she was left to wait, which she understood to be the first move of the game. A guest of consequence is received. A guest of no consequence is left to feel her own smallness in a large room until the largeness has done its work. B sat in the smallest chair she could find, on the principle that one ought to choose one's own diminishment before it is chosen for one, and waited. She did not wait long. There were voices in the corridor, a man's, low and amused, and a servant's, careful. And then the door opened, and the Duke of Calverton came in, still half-turned to finish a sentence to someone behind him, so that the first thing B ever saw of him was the line of his shoulder under a dark coat, and the ease with which he filled the doorway without seeming to try, and the laugh he was giving away to a footman, as though laughter cost him nothing, and he had a great deal of it to spare. Then he turned, and saw her, and the laugh arrived a half-second before he had decided whether to keep it. He was, she registered, with the flat, private honesty she reserved for things she would never say aloud, absurdly well made. Broad through the shoulder, dark-haired, with a mouth built for exactly the easy charm he was even now assembling on it, the way another man might straighten his cravat before a glass. He was perhaps 28. He had the look of a man for whom rooms rearranged themselves, for whom servants found chairs and women found reasons, and who had not, in some years, met a single thing he could not move with a smile. "Miss Allenby," he said, and the smile finished itself, and it was a very good smile. And Bee watched him spend it on her with the interest of a woman watching a man pour an excellent wine onto the floor. "My mother tells me you have come a great distance." "Your mother tells you a great many things, I imagine," Bee said. "Are they usually true?" The smile held. He was practiced. The smile would hold through a great deal. But something behind it took a small step back and looked at her with more attention than the words had earned. "Almost never," he said. "It is one of her chief charms." "Then we have that in common," said Bee. "I am also almost never true, when truth is inconvenient. The difference is that I know which times those are." She watched the Duke decide she was flirting, because that was the category his world had given him for a clever woman in a green room who had come a great distance to be looked at. She watched him reach for the line that would make her blush, or laugh, or both. She could see it coming the way one sees a footman cross a room with a tray. And she watched it not arrive, because she had already turned to the window and said, in a tone of mild scientific interest, "You have a damp patch on your ceiling, in the far corner, the same as my father's. I find it strangely comforting that a duke and a country rector should be undone by the identical defect. It suggests the rain does not read Debrett's." There was a silence of a particular quality. Bee had heard that quality before, in the instant after she had said the unsayable thing, the small, ringing pause in which a room decided whether to be offended. She had spent 4 positions learning to read it. This one did not resolve into offense. It resolved, after a moment, into a sound she had not expected. The Duke, behind her, laughing. Not the laugh he had brought into the room and tried to give away, but a shorter, more surprised one, lower in the chest. The kind a man gives when something has got past his guard before he could post it. "The rain does not read Debrett's," he repeated. "No, I don't believe it does." He came to stand a respectful distance from her at the window and looked up at the damp patch with her, as though it were a painting they were considering buying. "My steward assures me it is being attended to. My steward has assured me of this for 2 years." "Then either your steward is a liar, or your roof is a philosopher," said Bee. "I should want to know which, in your place. They require different remedies." "And in your place?" "In my place," said Bee, "one puts a bucket under it and reads Greek to the drip. My father's method. It has not mended the roof, but it has greatly improved his Greek." The Duke looked at her then with the whole of his attention, which she suspected was a thing not many people got, and which she found, she noted this with displeasure, as one notes the first symptom of a cold one cannot afford, was not unpleasant to be the object of. "Miss Allenby," he said, "you are not at all what I was promised." "No," said Bee pleasantly. "I shouldn't think I am. Your mother has a very particular sense of humor. You have my sympathy." She had 3 days to study him before the household had decided what she was, and she used them. She had not lied to the dowager in the carriage. She did not yet know what the woman truly meant, only that she meant more than she said, and Bee's whole life had been the business of hearing the more underneath the said. Her father heard sermons in birdsong, and her mother had heard, before she went, the future in a creditor's cough. Bee had inherited from both of them an ear that would not switch off, and a tongue that reported, too often and too soon, what the ear had caught. It had cost her, as advertised, 4 positions. It had also kept her, through years that ought to have broken a sensible woman, from the worst error of the poor and clever, which is to believe the people above you are wiser than you, because they are warmer. The Duke was not wiser than she was. She established this on the first morning, watching him with the household from a window seat in the long library, where she had been left to amuse herself among books no one had opened since the last Duke's time. He was, however, something she had not catalogued before. and B did love a thing she had not catalogued. He was lonely. It took her until the second day to be sure of it, because he hid it the way a rich man hides a debt. Not by paying it, but by spending loudly enough that no one thinks to ask. He rose before the house and rode out alone, and came back with the wind still cold in his coat and mud on his boots, and the look of a man returning from the only honest conversation he would have all day, which had been with a horse. He charmed his servants and his guests, and the vicar and the magistrate, and the tenants' wives, and each of them went away warmed, and he went away, each time, a little further into himself, like a fire that heats the whole cold room and is burned down to grey ash doing it. He could make anyone in Calverton smile. Bee watched him do it a dozen times, and she watched, too, the moment after each smile, the half-second before he assembled the next one, in which his face was simply tired, and then was not, because someone new had come into the room who needed warming. The first morning had set the pattern, and the pattern was breakfast. She came down to it expecting to eat alone, because a candidate of no consequence eats when the household has finished with her, and found instead the long room laid for two, silver warm under the morning light, the smell of coffee and grilled kidneys and toast thick in the air, a low fire snapping in the grate, and the Duke already in it, in his shirt-sleeves and an old coat, standing at the sideboard filling a plate for someone who was not himself. "My mother does not breakfast," he said, by way of greeting, without turning round. "She takes chocolate in her room, and reads the Post, and decides who is to be unhappy that day. It leaves the two of us at this hour. I did not know what you ate, so I have erred toward everything." "I eat what is put in front of me," said Bee, quickly and without comment, "because that is the custom in a house where the bread is counted. You may set it down, and I will deal with it. You needn't stand constructing the plate, like a man laying a table for a nervous mare he hopes to gentle." He set the plate before her. "That is the second comparison to livestock since I met you," he said. "I have begun a tally. At 10 I shall have it framed." "You will run short of paper," said Bee, and ate. She had meant the meal to be a study, and it was. He talked to the footman by his name, and asked after the man's mother, who had a bad hip, and was told the hip was no better, and looked, for the length of that exchange, more genuinely engaged than he had looked at her across the whole green room the day before. He ate almost nothing himself, a corner of toast abandoned, coffee he let go cold, while pressing on her, with the absent-minded generosity of a man who has never once gone without, more food than 3 rectories saw in a week. He asked her 3 questions about her journey, and listened to the answer of none of them, because in the gap after each, he was already assembling the next pleasant thing, the way a juggler keeps a hand free for the ball that has not yet come down. "You are not attending," Bee observed on the 3rd question. "You have asked me whether the roads were tolerable, and I've told you that we lost a wheel outside Marlborough, and were set upon by a flock of geese with strong opinions, and you have said, 'I am very glad to hear it.' I invented the geese to find out whether you were listening. You were not. It is all right. Most people aren't. I only mention it so that you stop wasting good questions on a woman who counts them." The Duke set down his cup and looked at her with the first, wholly unguarded face she had got out of him, caught, faintly appalled, and, underneath, something that might have been relief. "I was not listening," he admitted. "I am almost never listening. It is a thing I do instead of being present, and no one has ever—" He stopped, as he would stop a great many times in the coming weeks, at the edge of a sentence that ended in the same 3 words. "There were geese." "There were not geese," said Bee. "Try to keep up. It is the only entertainment on offer." After breakfast, she went looking for the house, because to understand a man, one must understand the country he rules, and the country a duke rules is below stairs. She found the kitchen by following her nose, and the cook by following the sound of weeping, and she sat herself down on the stool in the warm chaos of the place, uninvited, which was becoming her signature, and watched a large, red-armed woman cry into a bowl of batter, while the scullery maids pretended with great courtesy not to see. "You are over-salting it," said Bee after a while. Grief sorts everything twice. My mother's last Christmas pudding could have preserved a ship. Whatever it is, it will keep through the folding in, if you'd rather not say. But I find a thing set into a bowl rises better than a thing swallowed. The cook, her name was Mrs. Pell, Bea learned, and she had been at Calverton 30 years, looked up, astonished to be addressed at all by a guest, let alone seen, and the whole story came out of her over the next quarter hour, in the way stories come out of the unheard once someone holds still long enough. A sister in Bristol, a quarrel never mended, a letter that had come too late to mend it. The Duke, Bea gathered, had been kind about it. He was kind about everything. Kindness cost him nothing, and he scattered it like a man feeding pigeons. But he had been kind from a great height, a sovereign pardoning a subject's sorrow, and had then gone away, warmed by his own goodness, while the sorrow stayed exactly where it was, sitting in the steam and the smell of scorched milk, with no one to share its weight. Bea was not kind from a height. She did not have a height. She sat on the stool and ate a bad piece of the salted cake and called it bad, and asked 3 sharp questions about the sister in Bristol, and by the end of it, Mrs. Pell was laughing, wetly and against her will, and the batter was rescued, and Bea understood the whole architecture of the house, that it was warmed from the top and seen from nowhere, and that she had been hired, all unknowing, to be the first person in it who looked up from below. She filed the knowledge away with the rest. It went into the same drawer as the tiredness behind the smile, and the letter he had not answered, and the small, finer cup the dowager held as though it might be taken from her. Bea was assembling a person, the way another woman might assemble a trousseau, stitch by stitch, telling herself the whole time that she was only doing her work, that one cannot be effectively impossible to a man one has not studied. But the studying was strategy, and not the slow, helpless inventory of a heart, cataloguing the thing it has begun, against every instinct of self-preservation, to want. On the 3rd evening, she came down to dinner deliberately early, which a clever candidate for a duke's hand would not do, and found him alone in the library, with a glass he had not touched, and a letter he had not answered. And she saw him before he saw her, and she saw the tiredness sitting on him in the firelight, with its boots off and its feet up, entirely at home. The fire cracked low in the grate. The rest of the room had gone dark around the one warm island of it, and his face, unguarded, looked carved out of the soft gold light and the cold shadow beyond. Then he heard her, and turned, and reached for the smile. "Don't," said Bea. He stopped. "I beg your pardon." "You were about to be charming." She came into the room and sat down across from him, uninvited, which was its own small scandal, and which she committed on purpose, because she had been hired to be impossible, and because she wanted, for reasons she declined to examine, to see what he was when the charm was not there to stand in front of him. "You needn't, on my account. I am not a tenant's wife. You will not improve my opinion of you by warming me, and you will tire yourself, and then you'll be cross at dinner, and your mother will blame me, which," she considered, "she will do regardless, so perhaps it makes no difference. But still, don't. It's exhausting to watch." For a long moment the Duke of Calverton looked at her, and the smile did not come, and his face stayed as she had caught it. Tired, real, 28 and very far from anyone. And Bea felt the strange, small lurch of having reached through a window and touched, by accident, a thing she had only meant to observe. "No one," he said at last, slowly, "has ever told me to stop before." "No," said Bea. "I don't suppose they have. It would be like telling the sun to stop. Most people are too busy being warm to point out that the sun looks shattered by tea time." She picked up the letter he had not answered, read the direction, raised an eyebrow, and put it down again. "Your aunt. She wants money, and she has spelled your name wrong to get it. I'd leave that one for the drip if I were you." And the Duke laughed. The second laugh, the real one, low and caught out. And Bea understood, with the specific clarity of a woman watching a trap she has set for someone else, close, gently, on her own foot, that she was in a very great deal of trouble. The trouble did not announce itself. It worked the way real trouble always did, in increments small enough to deny. She told herself she was doing her work. The Dowager wished her son repelled. B was being repellent with a thoroughness the Dowager could not have imagined. She corrected the Duke at dinner before his guests. She declined to be impressed by the things he was accustomed to being admired for, the horses, the house, the famous easy address, and was instead impressed, loudly and at the wrong moments, by things no one was meant to notice. That the undergardener's boy had a good eye for grafting, that the cook had wept into the soup on Thursday, and that someone ought to ask her why. She made the Duke's guests uncomfortable. She made the Dowager's eyebrow climb. By every term of her commission, she was a triumph of unsuitability, and the Duke ought, by the Dowager's reckoning, to have been recoiling toward the nearest acceptable heiress by the end of the first week. He was not recoiling. He was, with an alarming and increasing single-mindedness, seeking her out. "You have made a strategic error," she informed the Dowager, in the green room on a wet Tuesday. "I'm to repel him. He does not repel. He approaches. I cannot work like this." The Dowager set down her cup with the precision of a woman who has never once in her life put a thing down carelessly. It was a small cup, B noticed, old, and finer than the rest of the set, a survivor from a service that no longer matched itself, and the Dowager held it as though it required holding, which a cup did not. "Then approach him harder," she said. "Be worse." "I cannot be worse," said B. "I'm at the edge of my abilities. I have told him his cellar is overrated, and his sermon-giving cousin is a bore, and that his mother, present company, engineered the seating at Friday's dinner to humiliate a baronet's wife who slighted her in 1809. He thanked me for the last one. He said it was the most interesting thing anyone had said at his table in a year. Your Grace, I'm being paid to be a poison, and your son has developed a taste for it." For a moment, and it was the first time B had seen it, though it would not be the last, the Dowager's composure showed a hairline crack, and through it B saw not anger, but something that startled her far more because it had the shape of fear. "He cannot," the Dowager said, very low. "He cannot be allowed to. You do not know." She stopped. She picked the small cup up again, though she had only just set it down, and held it, and the holding steadied her, and the crack closed. "You will continue," she said in her ordinary voice. "You will be paid. That is the whole of our arrangement, and the whole of your concern." "It is not the whole of my concern," said B. "But it is the whole of yours, evidently. So I'll go and be a poison." She rose. At the door she stopped, because the thing her ear had caught would not let her leave without saying it, though every instinct of self-preservation she possessed was telling her to keep her mouth shut and her position safe. "Your Grace, the cup. You hold it like it's the last warm thing in the house. Whose was it?" The Dowager went perfectly still. "I told you," said B, more gently than she had said anything since arriving, "that when I worked out what you meant, you'd be the second to know. I haven't worked it out. But I've worked out that you mean it about yourself, somehow, and not only about him. That's all. Good morning." She left before the Dowager could answer, which was a mercy to them both, and she went to be a poison, and was very bad at it, because she could not stop thinking about a woman, holding a cup, as though it might be taken away. The first real friction came over a question of class, as B had always known it would, because between a duke and a rector's daughter, the question of class is the weather. It is always there, and the only choice is whether to pretend you have not noticed the rain. They had fallen, by the second week, into the long library in the afternoons. It was the one room in Calverton that no one else wanted. The books were old, and the chairs were older, and the famous easy address had no audience there. And so it had become, without either of them deciding it, theirs. The Duke brought the estate's correspondence and pretended to work. B brought whatever volume the late Duke had left face down on a table 40 years before, and read it, and reported its contents, whether asked or not. Over the door, carved in stone the colour of old butter, ran the family motto, Tenax Propositi. Above the fireplace hung a portrait of the third Duke, looking as though the motto had been carved on his liver. Tenacious of purpose, the Duke translated the first day, following her gaze. My grandfather had it cut there. He felt the family was insufficiently grim. It's wrong, said B.
I beg your pardon. It is 400 years old.
It can be 400 years old and wrong. The two are not exclusive. Ask any bishop. She tilted her head at it. Tenax propositi. It hasn't a verb. It's not a sentence. It's a man clearing his throat in Latin. What your grandfather wanted to say was something like, we hold to what we have decided, and what he actually carved was holding of the thing decided, which is the kind of mistake a man makes when he is more interested in being grand than in being understood. It runs in your family, I expect. The Duke set down his pen. You are calling my ancestors illiterate. I'm calling them rich, said B. It's a different complaint, but the symptoms overlap. And the Duke laughed, and that ought to have been the whole of it, except that he then made the error that men of his kind made without knowing they made it. The error that was the true subject of the family motto, and could not be carved over any door, because no one was tenacious enough of purpose to admit to it. I shall have it recut, he said warmly. You shall tell me the correct Latin, and I shall have a mason in from York, and we shall fix 400 years of error in an afternoon. There. You see how easily a thing is mended when one has the means. He had meant it as a gift. B understood that. He had meant, you have noticed a true thing, and I, being who I am, can act on it, and in acting on it I honour you. It was, in its way, the kindest thing he had said to her, and it landed on her like cold water, because underneath it, unheard by him, ran the whole architecture of the world that had cost her father his roof, and her mother her last good winter, and B herself 4 positions, and her pride more times than she could count. Yes, she said, and her voice had changed, and she watched him hear it change and not understand why. You see how easily a thing is mended when one has the means. That is precisely the thing I have spent my life seeing. My father has been seeing the same thing for 30 years, from underneath. There is a great deal of error in the world, Your Grace, that has gone 400 years uncut, because the people who noticed it had no mason in York, and no afternoon to spare, being occupied in the business of not starving. You think you are offering to mend the motto. You are offering to demonstrate very kindly the exact distance between us. I thank you not to. I find the view from down here clear enough without your help. She had gone too far. She always went too far. It was the engine of her and the wreck of her both. She braced for the cooling, the small ducal withdrawal, the moment when warmth becomes condescension's twin, and a clever poor woman is reminded of her place by a man who is too well bred to do it in words. It did not come. The Duke sat very still, and the easy address was nowhere on him, and what was on him instead was the thing she had caught him at by the fire. The realness, the attention, turned now entirely on what she had said, and turning it over, and finding, she could see, that it weighed more than he had expected when he picked it up. No, he said slowly. You're right. I was offering you the distance and calling it a gift. I do that. I've always done that. And no one has ever. He stopped and looked at her, and there was something almost like vertigo in his face. The look of a man who has been walking a corridor all his life and discovered a window in a wall he had thought was solid. What ought I to have said? You ought to have said, B told him, that I was right, and left it there, and let me keep the small satisfaction of being right without buying it from me with a mason.
That's all anyone wants, Your Grace, who has nothing. To be right, occasionally, and to be allowed to keep it.
He was quiet for a moment. Then,
Beatrice, he said.
Her name, for the first time, without the miss, which was its own kind of trespass, and which she let stand, which was hers.
You are the most uncomfortable thing that has ever happened to me. I find I cannot do without it.
That, said B, picking her book back up so that he could not see her face,
is a great pity for us both.
Care, in that house, did not announce itself either. It came the way the spring came outside the long windows, without permission, in small, irreversible increments, until one looked up and the whole world had turned green while one was arguing about Latin. Each afternoon, the fire was lit a little earlier, the rain soft on the glass, the smell of wood smoke and old leather bindings warm in the long room. And Bee learned the place by its sounds, the way she had learned the rectory. The particular creak of the third floorboard, the whisper of pages, the thud of a heavy folio set down. She did not notice the first time he had her favorite chair moved nearer the fire, because she felt the cold. She only noticed, a week in, that the chair was always nearer the fire now, and that no one had asked her, and that this was either the most high-handed thing a man had ever done to her, or the most attentive, and that she could not, for the life of her, decide which was itself a kind of answer she declined to read. She did not notice the books appearing, the ones she had mentioned wanting, the Greek her father loved, a botanical folio with plates of plants she had named correctly when the Duke had named them wrongly. Each one arriving on the library table face up, where the late Dukes had lain face down, as though the room were slowly being turned over to the light. She noticed, eventually, all of it at once, the way one notices one has been warm for some time, only when a door opens and lets in the cold. And she noticed that she had begun to feed him, which alarmed her more than any of it. It was a small thing, and it became a ritual without either of them naming it. He worked too long and ate too little, and warmed the whole house, and forgot to be warmed himself. And so B, who had grown up in a household where love was a thing you could not afford to say, and so said instead with the last of the bread, began to put a plate at his elbow in the afternoons, a warm wedge of the weeping cook's excellent seed cake, sweet and dense, and still smelling of the oven, an apple cut the way her father liked it, a cup of tea made strong because she had observed that he drank it weak out of some misplaced ducal restraint, and was happier strong. She did it without comment. He ate it without comment. It was the most honest conversation either of them had, and it happened entirely in seed cake. "You are managing me," he said one afternoon, looking at the plate.
"I am feeding you," said B. "It is what I do with creatures who are too foolish to feed themselves. We have a goat at home with the identical complaint."
"I am being compared to a goat."
"Favorably," said B. "The goat is also charming and overconfident, and eats things that are bad for it. The comparison is meant kindly. You should be flattered. I am very fond of the goat."
And the Duke, who had, by B's count, been being charming at the world for some 28 years, and had perhaps 4 times in that span been simply accidentally seen, looked at the plate, and looked at her, and said, with a dryness she had not known was in him, a wit she had been waiting for without admitting she was waiting, "Does the goat know how fortunate it is? Or does it, too, take its cake without thanks, and compare you unfavorably to a more attentive shepherd?" It was the first joke he had ever made that was his own, and not the house's. Not the easy charm, but something drier and stranger, and entirely Gabriel. A thing that had been underneath the warmth all along, waiting for a person who would not be warmed to come and pull it out. And Bee was so surprised by it, by the small, private competence of it, that she laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh, undefended. And she saw him watch her do it the way a man watches the first fire he has ever successfully lit. Catch and hold. "There," he said softly. "I have made you laugh. I have been trying for a fortnight. I begin to understand why the world tries so hard to make me do it. It is a great deal of work, and worth every minute. Don't get a taste for it, said B, when she had her breath. I laugh very rarely and at very low things. It is no compliment to you. It is a comment on the quality of my amusements. But it was a compliment to him, and they both knew it. And the knowing sat in the warm room between them with the seed cake, and neither of them touched it, because to touch it would be to name it, and to name it would be to end the comfortable fiction that this was a transaction, a poison and her patron, a candidate and her duke, a woman doing a job for a folded banknote she had not, she realized with a small internal shock, looked at in 11 days. It was the horse that undid her in the end, or began the undoing, though she would have said, had anyone asked, that she was entirely undisturbed, that she had merely consented to walk to the stables on a fine morning because the alternative was to sit in the green room and let the dowager's silence improve her posture. The Duke had asked her the evening before, with the studied carelessness she had learned to read as the opposite of careless, whether she rode. She did not ride. A rector's daughter walks. But she had said, instead of the simple truth, that she had strong opinions about horses and limited experience of being on top of one, which the Duke had taken, correctly, as a yes to the stables and a no to the saddle, and had looked absurdly pleased about, the way he looked pleased whenever she gave him a sentence he had to unpack, rather than merely receive. The stables at Calverton were grander than the rectory, and warmer than the rectory, and smelled, B thought, considerably more honest than most of the rooms in the great house, of straw and leather, and the clean animal heat of large creatures with nothing to prove. The Duke walked her down the row, naming horses, and she saw at once that here, and perhaps only here, the famous easy address fell away of its own accord, because a horse cannot be charmed, and a horse cannot be impressed, and a horse does not care in the smallest degree that one is a duke. He was, among his horses, simply a man who was good with them, and the goodness was real and unwitnessed, and therefore, B understood this with the small, sinking feeling that had become her constant companion, the truest thing she had yet seen of him. And what? Asked the cold clerk in the back of her mind, the one who kept the accounts no one else would keep. Do you imagine happens to a hired poison who lets herself see the truest thing in a man? There was a banknote upstairs, with her name attached to the opposite of this. There was a dowager downstairs, with a plan that did not include a rector's daughter standing in a warm stable, feeling her own defenses come quietly down in the straw. She heard the question. She had heard it for days. She declined, once again, to answer it, and that refusal, she would see it later, far too late, was the first brick she pulled out of her own wall. "This is Hector," he said, stopping at the last box, where a great grey hunter put its head over the door and lipped at his coat with the proprietary insolence of an old friend. "He is 17 and bad-tempered, and has thrown me into more ditches than I can decently count, and I would not sell him for the dukedom. We understand each other. He thinks I am a fool, and I think he is right, and on that foundation we have built a long and contented partnership." "At last," said B, "a relationship in your life founded on honest contempt. I had begun to despair of you." She let the grey lip at her own glove, fearlessly, because she had been raised among animals and had no city nervousness to overcome. "He has a kind eye under the temper. They generally do, the difficult ones. It is the easy ones I never trust. A creature that likes everybody has told you nothing when it likes you." "You are describing me again," said the Duke. "I am describing the goat," said B. "But the application is general, and you may take from it what fits." He laughed. The real one. By now she could tell them apart in the dark. The brought-in laugh and the caught-out one. And she had grown, against her will, to angle for the second, the way a fisherman angles for the better water. He reached past her to gentle the grey, and his arm came near hers, and neither of them moved away from it. And the not moving sat between them in the straw-warm dark, louder than anything either had said. And B looked very hard at Hector's kind eye, and thought about the wheel they had lost outside Marlborough, and the exact number of days she had not looked at the banknote, and said, because the engine of her would not idle, You bring all your women to the stables, I expect. It is very clever. A horse makes any man look gentle, and a gentle man is 3/4 of the way to a settlement. I commend the strategy. I only object to being its object. The Duke was quiet for a moment, his hand on the grey's nose. Then he said, without any charm at all, which was how she knew it cost him, I have never brought anyone to the stables. My mother thinks them dirty. My guests think them an obligation, and admire the horses the way they admire the pictures, which is to say loudly and without looking. You were the first person who has stood in this row and said a true thing about a horse to me. He turned. I did not bring you here to gentle you, Beatrice. I brought you here because it is the only room in my life where I am not performing, and I wanted, very much, to find out whether you would still. The sentence went over the same cliff as all the others. Whether you would still be you in it. You are. You are worse, if anything. I am exceedingly relieved. She had no answer to that, which was itself a catastrophe, because B always had an answer. The having of answers was the wall behind which she lived, and the Duke saw the wall fail to assemble itself, and had the grace, the unexpected and devastating grace, not to press the advantage. He turned back to the horse. He let her have the silence to repair herself in, which was the kindest thing anyone had done for her since her mother, and crueler than any unkindness, because a woman can defend herself against a man who pushes, and has no defense at all against one who simply, quietly, makes room. They walked back through the park the long way, because neither of them suggested the short, and the spring was coming on absurdly all around them, blackthorn frothing white in the hedges, and the first lambs being ridiculous in the lower meadow. And the Duke told her about the estate as they walked, not the way he told his guests, the rehearsed magnificence, but the real account. The wet field that would not drain, and the cottages whose roofs were as bad as her father's, and the tenant whose son he was quietly paying to school because the boy had a head for figures and no money to feed it. He had not meant to tell her the last one. She heard him not mean to, heard the small surprised pause after it, the same pause she had heard after the geese. You hide your good deeds, she said, as carefully as another man hides his bad ones. Why? It is the one extravagance you decline to be admired for, and it is the only one worth admiring. Because if it is known, it becomes a thing I am doing to be known for it, he said. And then it is no longer for the boy, it is for me. I have a great deal that is for me, Beatrice. I should like one or two things that are not. He glanced at her, sidelong, almost shy, an expression she would not have believed that confident mouth could hold. I have never said that to anyone. I notice I keep saying that to you. It is becoming monotonous. You must find it tiresome, being the first to hear everything. I find it, said B, and stopped, because the true answer was terrifying, and the false answer would not come. I find it the only interesting thing that has ever happened to me, which I shall deny under oath, so do not look so pleased. And the Duke laughed, and did look pleased, insufferably, the whole way back to the house, and B walked beside him with the lilac not yet out, and the lambs being foolish, and her own heart being more foolish still. And somewhere in the 11th or 12th day of a transaction, she understood that the transaction was over, had been over for some time, and that she was now simply a woman walking through a green spring beside a man she had been paid to repel, and had instead, catastrophically, come to need. What B did not know, sitting in the warm library with her unnamed thing and her unread banknote, was that the world outside the long windows had begun to talk. She learned it the way one always learns these things, sideways and too late. A carriage came that should not have come. Lady Carstairs, a connection of the Dowager's, with a daughter of marriageable age and a nose for advantage that could find a vulnerable dukedom across 3 counties. The daughter, Miss Penelope Carstairs, was everything B was hired not to be. Golden, gracious, suitable, with a settlement behind her like a wall, and a manner so smooth it left no place for a sharp word to find purchase. And B, watching her arrive, watching the dowager receive her with a warmth that had a strategy inside it, understood several things at once. She understood that the dowager's plan had 2 prongs, and that B had only ever been told about one. She was the poison, yes, the worst of what the Duke claimed to want, paraded before him to cure the fever. But a fever cured leaves a vacancy, and into the vacancy, the dowager had always intended to slide the cure. A suitable bride, a wall of settlement, a golden, gracious girl who would never tell a duke his motto was wrong, or compare him to a goat. B was the cliff. Penelope was the soft landing on the far side. And B had been so busy being a triumph of unsuitability, so busy with the seed cake and the Latin and the warm chair near the fire, that she had not seen the second prong coming until it was standing in the hall in travelling silk the colour of butter, smiling at the Duke with a wall behind it. It should not have mattered to her. She told herself, with great firmness in the green room, that it did not matter to her, that she was a poison with a banknote, that her work was nearly done, that a wise woman in her position would be glad to see the cure arrive, because it meant the commission was succeeding and the money was real. Was she not glad then? She put the question to herself in the dowager's own clipped voice, the way she put all her hardest questions, and waited for the yes. And the yes did not come. She told herself this several times. She was an excellent and experienced liar, and she did not believe a word of it, which was how she knew the trouble had finished arriving and had taken off its coat and meant to stay. At dinner that night, the table was the dowager's masterpiece. B placed low and Penelope placed high. B given the bore of a cousin and Penelope given the Duke. The whole architecture of the meal a sentence in the dowager's flawless social Latin that said, "This is the future, and that is the past, and watch how easily the one slides into the other." B watched. She was good at watching, and he watched the Duke be charming at Penelope Carstairs the whole length of the soup and the fish, the famous easy address out in full, warming the golden girl who needed no warming, and she watched the tiredness sit behind it, and she watched him glance twice, 3 times, down the table to where the poison sat being witty for a bore, as though to check that she was seeing this, as though the performance were for her benefit and not the girl's. And she thought, with the cold clarity that was her one reliable possession, he is doing it on purpose. He is showing me the cure to see if I mind. He is 28 and a duke, and he does not know how to ask a woman whether she minds, so he is making her watch him be wonderful at someone else, like a boy. Penelope Carstairs, for her part, was wonderful back at him with the effortless competence of a girl who had been bred for exactly this and trained at it since the schoolroom. She admired the soup. She admired the room. She admired, with a soft little laugh that had been polished on 100 better tables than this one, a witticism of the Duke's that had not, by any honest measure, been witty. She agreed with everything and disagreed with nothing, and asked, at precisely the right intervals, the precisely flattering question. And B, watching her work down the table, felt a grudging professional respect of the kind one craftsman feels for another in a different and inferior trade. The girl was very good at her job. It was only that her job was to be a wall, and a wall, however gracious, has nothing to say to the rain. "Miss Allenby," said Penelope at last, turning the full warmth of her attention down the table with the air of a queen noticing a minor county. "You have come from quite far away, I understand. The Duke tells me your father has a living somewhere remote. How brave of you to travel so. I confess I should be quite lost beyond the home counties. One hears such things about the roads." "One does," agreed B. "I heard a flock of geese outside Marlborough only last week, expressing strong views. But I find the trick of the provinces is to remember that the people in them are the same size as the people in London. Smaller incomes, the same dimensions. It saves a great deal of squinting." There was a small pause, the kind B had learned to read, while the table decided whether it had been insulted. Penelope, who was not clever enough to be certain, but well trained enough to be wary, produced her polished little laugh, and applied it to the difficulty until the difficulty went away. The bore of a cousin beside B, a Mr. Fanshawe, who had spent the soup explaining the principles of drainage to a woman who had grown up watching her father's study flood, leaned in and said, with the confidence of a man who has never once been interesting, "Miss Allenby is droll. I've noticed it. She is quite the wit." He said it the way another man might note that a dog could do a trick. "I am not droll, Mr. Fanshawe," said B pleasantly. "Drollery is the art of being amusing on purpose. I am merely truthful at inconvenient moments, which produces a similar sound and a wholly different effect. You will know the difference by morning, when you find you cannot remember whether you liked me." Up the table, the Duke laughed, the real one, helpless, before he could decide whether to keep it, and B heard it land in the careful machinery of the dinner like a dropped spanner. She saw the Dowager's eyes come to rest on her, cold and exact. She saw Penelope's smile hold by main force, and she saw the Duke realize, a half-second too late, what his own laugh had announced to a table full of people who counted such things for a living. That the witticisms he had been spending on the golden girl with the wall were courtesies, and the laugh he had just given the rector's daughter with the empty purse was something he could not help, and that the whole county would have the difference catalogued by the time the cloth was drawn. He tried to mend it. He turned back to Penelope, and was charming, more charming, charming with the desperate fluency of a man papering over a crack he has only just noticed. And B watched him do it, and watched the tiredness pool behind it, and watched him glance down the table at her once more, helplessly, as though to ask her what he should do, as though she, of all the women in the room, were the one he wanted on his side of a thing she was being paid to lose. She minded. She minded so much that it frightened her. And being frightened, B did the thing she always did when she was frightened, which was the thing that had cost her 4 positions. She opened her mouth. "Miss Carstairs," she said, into a lull, in her clearest, carrying voice. "You mustn't let the Duke charm you. He can't help it. It's a nervous condition, but it means nothing. He charms the magistrate and the vicar and the goat with precisely the same address. The only sure sign of his regard is if he stops. If he is ever simply tired in your presence and lets you see it and does not reach for a single pretty thing to say, then you may have him. Until then you have only the Duke. Everyone has the Duke. The man is harder to come by." The table went silent. It was, B knew even as the last word left her, an unforgivable thing to have said. It was too true, and too much, and said in front of too many people, and it had named, in front of his mother and his guests, and the golden girl with the wall, the exact private thing that had been growing in the warm library, had thrown it on the table, where everyone could see it, out of fear, out of a jealousy she had no right to and could not master. She had meant to wound Penelope. She had instead exposed herself, completely, in one sentence, the way she always did, and she sat in the wreck of it and waited for the cost. The Duke had gone very still, and then, slowly, while the table held its breath, he set down his fork, and he looked down the length of the table at Beatrice Allenby, and he did the thing she had described. He stopped. The charm went out of his face like a tide going out, and underneath it was the tiredness, and underneath the tiredness was something else she had not seen before and could not name. And he let her see all of it, the whole undefended length of it, in front of his mother and his guests and the golden girl. And he said, very quietly, so that the whole silent table had to lean to hear it, "Then I suppose you have me, Miss Allenby. I appeared to have stopped some time ago. I had been wondering when you would notice." The Dowager did not summon her that night. The Dowager waited 2 days, which B understood to be a punishment in itself. 2 days in which the household reorganized itself around a new and unmistakable fact, in which Penelope Carstairs' carriage was quietly ordered for the end of the week, in which the Duke sought B out in the library and found her, each time, gone, because she had taken to hiding, among the cold copper pans and the sharp green smell of the still room, under the blossom in the orchard with the wet grass soaking her hem, and once, ignominiously, crouched among the cool smooth linen and the lavender dry dark of a press, in flat animal panic at what she had done and what it meant and what it would cost. On the third morning, the Dowager found her in the long library at an hour when she should have been safe, and B, turning from the window, saw the older woman's face and braced for the blow. It did not come the way she expected. The Dowager came into the room slowly, and she was holding the small cup, the survivor, the finest one, and she crossed to the fire and stood looking up at the wrong Latin over the door. And for a moment, she did not seem to be a duchess at all, but only a woman in a large, cold room, holding the last warm thing in the house. "My father," said the Dowager, to the motto, not to be, "kept a shop in Norwich. He sold cloth, good cloth. He had an eye and a tongue that could sell frost to a Finn, and he raised a daughter with both, and dressed her above her station, and pushed her at every assembly in 3 counties until a viscount's son with debts and bad eyesight mistook her for a gentlewoman and married her before anyone could correct him. I was 19. I learned to hold a cup so that my hands would not shame me. I learned 30 things a day for 11 years, and I learned them perfectly, because the alternative was to be found out. And I have never, not once in 40 years, been found out." She turned the small cup in her hands, the firelight sliding along its worn gilt rim. "This was my mother's. It is the only thing of hers I kept. The rest I burned, with the accent, and the shop, and the girl. I burned her down to the ground and built this in her place." A small gesture, the cup taking in the room, the house, the title, the whole magnificent edifice. And I have guarded it every hour since, because I know, as the people born to it never know, how thin the floor is, and how far the fall. B did not move. She had learned, at last, to keep her mouth shut at the moment it mattered most. "My son," said the Dowager, "wishes to marry where his heart leads. He says it as though it is brave. He does not know that I married where my heart led, once, before the viscount's son, a clerk, with no debts and good eyes and nothing else, who loved me and would have kept me poor and happy and invisible for the rest of my life. I chose the cloth. I chose the climb. I have not been happy and I have not been invisible, and I would, God forgive me, choose it again, because I have seen what happens to women who choose the clerk, and it is worse, Miss Allenby. It is so much worse than this." Her voice did not break. It was steadier than anything B had ever heard, which was somehow far worse than breaking. "I chose you to cure him because you were the proof. The rector's daughter, with the sharp tongue and the empty purse. The future he thinks he wants, made flesh, so he could look at it and recoil and be saved. I did not expect—" And here, at last, the smallest catch, swallowed before it could finish. "I did not expect him to look at it and want it more. I did not expect you to be the clerk. I had forgotten there was a version where the clerk wins." "He hasn't won anything," said B, very low. "I'm a poison. You hired me. There's a banknote in my room I haven't spent." "I know what I hired," said the Dowager. "I am telling you what I sold." She set the small cup down on the mantel, carefully, in the warmest place. And for the first time since the carriage, she looked at B not as an instrument, but as a person. As, B understood with a jolt, a younger and more dangerous version of herself, the road she had not taken, walking about her house in a darned dress and being right about the Latin. "Take the money," the Dowager said. "Take it and go, and let me bring the Carstairs girl back, and let my son recoil at the cliff and land safe in the wall, and in 20 years he will thank me, as I have spent 40 years not thanking my father, which is its own form of thanks. Or stay, and watch what the world does to a duchess who came up from a parish I cannot find on a map. I have shown you the floor, Miss Allenby. I have never shown it to anyone. Do with it what you will." She left, and B stood in the warm library with the wrong Latin over the door and the small cup warming on the mantel, and understood, finally and completely, the thing she had told the dowager in the carriage she would one day work out. That the woman had meant it about herself all along. That the joke had been a confession. That she had been hired not as a poison, but as a ghost. The ghost of a girl a duchess had burned down 40 years ago, and never stopped guarding the ashes of. She meant to go. She was a sensible woman, fundamentally, underneath the tongue, and the sensible thing was painted in front of her in letters a foot high. Take the money, mend the roof, save her father's last winters, and leave the Duke to the wall and the warmth and the cure his mother had bought him for his own good. She had been hired to leave. Leaving was the job, and she had the dowager's whole terrible life in her hands now as the argument for it. I have seen what happens to women who choose the clerk. Delivered by a witness who had paid for her testimony in 4 decades of holding a cup so her hands would not shame her. She packed. She got as far as the banknote, which she took out of the drawer where it had lain unspent for 18 days, and unfolded, and read the sum on for the first time since the carriage. And she stood holding it the way the dowager held the cup, as though it were the last warm thing in the house, and she discovered that it was not. The last warm thing in the house was downstairs, eating seed cake he had not asked for, harder to come by than the Duke, and waiting in a library that had been turned slowly over to the light. The Duke found her on the 3rd step of the terrace, where she had gone with her packed bag, and then failed, comprehensively, to keep walking. The spring evening was coming down green and gold over the park, the stone of the terrace step cold and rough under her, and the lilacs by the terrace had opened, while she had been arguing about Latin, and the smell of them was everywhere, sweet and heavy on the cool air, uninvited, like everything else that mattered. "You're leaving," he said. He had run, she could hear it. The famous address was nowhere, and he had not stopped to assemble anything before coming out. "Beatrice, you're leaving, and you weren't going to—" He stopped. "Tell me why. Not a clever reason. I have had a great many clever reasons in my life, and I find I cannot eat them. Tell me the true one." And B, who had spent her life saying the true thing too soon and too much, found that the one time it might save her, she could barely get it out at all. "Because your mother is right," she said. "Not about the joke. About the floor. I know how thin it is, Gabriel. I have lived my whole life on it. If I stay, if you do the mad thing your eyes have been doing for a fortnight, I will be a duchess from a parish you cannot find on a map, and the world will never once let me forget it. And there will be mornings you look at me across a table full of people like the Carstairs and wonder just for a half-second whether your mother was right after all. And I would rather leave now, while it is still only seed cake and Latin, than stay and watch you wonder." The Duke was quiet. The lilacs poured their ridiculous sweetness over the whole impossible conversation, and then he sat down beside her on the 3rd step of the terrace, a duke in his evening coat on cold stone. And he did not reach for her hand, and he did not reach for a clever thing to say, and he was simply, entirely tired, and let her see it, which was the only language she had ever told him she trusted. "I have wondered a great many things in my life," he said. "I have wondered whether anyone has ever liked me or only liked the Duke. I have wondered whether I have a single thought that is mine and not the house's. I sat in that library for 2 years, with a roof that wept, and a steward who lied, and a charm I could not switch off. And I wondered, every evening at exactly the hour you found me, whether this was all there was going to be, the warming, and the being consumed by it, and no one, ever, not once, telling me to stop." He turned and looked at her. "And then a rector's daughter walked into a green room and told me my ceiling was the same as her father's,
and the rain did not read debrettes, and to stop, for God's sake, because it was exhausting to watch. And I have not wondered, Beatrice, from that hour to this, whether your mother was right. The one thing I have never once wondered is that. They had 2 days of it. He would think of them afterward, at the inn, as the 2 days, the only stretch of her life she had ever spent inside happiness, rather than watching it through a window in someone else's house. And she had been so busy being inside it that she had failed, for once in her vigilant life, to keep one eye on the door. They did not announce anything. There was nothing yet to announce. The Duke had said the word on the terrace, without quite saying the other words, and B had not said anything at all, and they had simply got up off the cold stone and gone in to dinner, and the whole house had felt the change in the weather, the way a barometer feels it, without a single barometer being told. The Dowager said nothing. Penelope's carriage had been ordered. The library, in those 2 days, became something it had not been before. Not a refuge they pretended was a workroom, but a room 2 people sat in together and admitted they were glad to. Once, in the middle of it, a board creaked in the corridor, and Bee's head came up like a hare's, her whole body gone still and listening. And there was nothing, only a maid with coals, and she made herself unclench, and could not have said, if asked, what she had braced for. Something was coming. She knew the way she always knew, in the skin and the back of the neck, before the ear could name it. She told herself it was nothing. She was wrong. And a part of her, the part that never switched off, knew she was wrong. And she ignored it, because she was warm. He read to her. This astonished her more than anything that had come before, because she had never in her life been read to by anyone who was not trying to teach her something. Her father read Greek at the Leek and Latin at the parish, and had read to Bee only to correct her accent. The Duke read badly, with a Duke's confidence and a schoolboy's grasp of the subjunctive, his voice warm and unhurried in the firelit room, the rain ticking soft against the long windows, and a candle guttering low at his elbow. And Bee corrected him mercilessly, and he kept losing his place because he was watching her face instead of the page. And it was the happiest hour she had passed since her mother went. "You are a terrible reader," she told him. "You perform every comma. You read as though the words were guests you were determined to charm." "I read as though someone were listening," he said, for the first time. "It makes a man nervous. You will have to be patient with me. I have charmed audiences my whole life, and never once read to a single person who would notice if I got it wrong. You notice everything. It is unbearable. Do it again." And she did, leaning over to set his finger on the right line, close enough to catch the warmth of him and the faint horse and cedar smell that was simply Gabriel. And he turned his head, and for a moment the page was forgotten entirely, and the small distance between them held its breath. And then Bee, because she was a coward in exactly one thing and brave in all the rest, took refuge in the engine that never failed her and said, "Subjunctive, Your Grace. The mood of things that have not happened yet but might." And the Duke laughed, low and rueful, and said, "I am painfully aware of the mood, Beatrice," and went back to the page, and let her have the door she had run to, again, the way he always did. On the second evening, he had a plate of seed cake brought to the library without her asking, and set it at her elbow, mirror to the ritual she had built around him. And Bee looked at it, and felt her eyes sting in a way she despised and could not govern. "You are managing me," she said, which was what he had said weeks before over the first plate. "I am feeding you," said the Duke, with enormous satisfaction, having clearly been saving the line for a fortnight. It is what one does with creatures too foolish to feed themselves. "I am told there is a goat of your acquaintance with the identical complaint. I have hopes of meeting it. I have hopes," he added, more quietly, no charm anywhere in it, "of a great many things I have not let myself have hopes of before, and it is entirely your fault. And I find I do not want it mended." She should have heard the door then. She had spent her whole life hearing doors. But she was inside the happiness, eating seed cake a duke had ordered for her, being read bad Latin in a warm room turned over to the light, and for 2 days, the vigilant ear that had cost her 4 positions and saved her from 100 griefs, simply, blessedly, switched itself off. And that, she would think later, was the one true luxury she had ever permitted herself. And it cost her more than the banknote was worth. The dark came as the dark always comes. Not in the quiet of the terrace, but 2 days later, in the worst possible room, in front of the worst possible witnesses, with the truth arriving like a guest no one had invited, and everyone had been expecting. Lady Carstairs had not gone quietly. A balked matchmaker is the most dangerous creature in any county, and she had spent her 2 days of grace doing what such women do, which was to ask questions in the right ears. And the right ears had answers, because the dowager's masterpiece of a household was staffed by people who had carried trays for 40 years and missed nothing. And one of them, for a coin, had carried the answer out. By the end of the week, it was known. It was known at the assembly, the great spring assembly at the county seat, where the Duke had brought Bee on his arm in defiance of every sensible thing, known and whispered and passed hand to hand behind the fans, that the rector's daughter on the Duke of Calverton's arm was no candidate and no connection, but a hired thing, a poison the dowager herself had brought in to disgust her son out of love, a joke, a paid joke, a nobody bought by the week to be impossible. And now look, only look. The joke has caught the Duke. The cliff has caught the man it was built to repel. And does he know? Do you suppose he knows what he is parading on his arm? Does the great Duke of Calverton know that his bride was purchased by his own mother as an insult? He had not known. Bee saw the instant he learned it. Lady Carstairs, smiling in a doorway, with the whole assembly arranged to watch, said the unsayable thing aloud, and dressed it as concern. "But surely, Your Grace, you knew. Your own dear mother engaged her, by the week, I'm told. There is even a sum, they say, a banknote. Surely a man of your address was not taken in by a creature he was meant to throw away." And Bee, beside him, felt the whole architecture of the warm library come down in a single sentence, and she watched the Duke's face, and she made the only true mistake of her life. She misread him. She had spent her whole life reading people accurately and saying what she read too soon. And now, at the one moment when accuracy was everything, she read him wrong. She saw the charm go out of his face, the tide going out, the way it had gone at the dinner table, and she saw the tiredness underneath it, and she saw, behind the tiredness, the thing she had no name for, and in her terror, she named it contempt, she told herself, in the long, ringing silence of the assembly, the cruelest story she knew, because it was the one she had been braced for her whole life. And a braced-for blow is almost a relief. "He has learned what I am," she told herself. "He has learned I took the money to be impossible at him, that I was a thing his mother bought to throw away, that every sharp word and every plate of seed cake was a performance I was paid for. He had been charmed by a poison, and now he knew it was a poison, hired and folded into a banknote in a drawer. And a man does not love the joke once he has been told it is a joke. He had only ever wanted the version of her he had made up in a warm library. The real one came with a price written on it in his mother's hand, and now he knew the price, and the wanting was already curdling into the recoil his mother had paid so much to produce. She did not stay to be discarded. She had her pride. It was nearly all she had ever had, and she would not stand in a doorway full of fans and watch a duke decide she was a joke. She turned, in the ringing silence, and she walked the length of the assembly, through the heat of 100 candles, and the press of silk, and the sweet, stifling fog of scent and beeswax, past the whisper of fans, the music faltering, every eye bright and sharp on her skin, with her head up and her face composed, past the dowager, who had gone the colour of the small cup, past Lady Carstairs' terrible smile, and out into the spring night, where the cold air hit her hot face like clean water. She did not let herself run until the lights of the assembly were behind her. And then she ran, in her one good dress, her breath loud, her slippers thin on the rough stone of the road, down into the dark, away from the warmest thing she had ever found, toward the cold she understood.
Behind her, in the assembly, the Duke of Calverton stood where she had left him. She did not see what he did. She had decided what he did. The two were not the same thing, and she had spent her life knowing the difference, and had, this once, the one time it could save her, refused to listen to her own ear. She got as far as the Crossroads Inn before she ran out of road and money, and the will to use either. She took a room she could not afford with the Dowager's banknote, which she could afford, which was the whole bitter joke of it. She was, at last, rich, exactly as promised, on the terms the Dowager had spoken and not the terms either of them had meant. The room was cold and smelled of tallow and damp plaster. A hard rain had started against the small dark window, and the rough wool blankets scraped under her fingers. She sat on the edge of a strange bed, with the note in her hand, and the lilac smell still somehow caught in her hair. And she did the sum of her life. And the sum came out as it always had. A clever, poor woman, alone, with her pride intact, and everything else spent, having said the true thing too late for once, instead of too soon, and lost the warm library forever to a story she had told herself in a doorway. The Dowager came at noon the next day. Bea heard the carriage, and knew it by the very quality of its arrival, the way a duchess's horses were pulled up, the particular silence of well-paid wheels. And she stood, because she would not be found sitting. And the door opened, and the Dowager Duchess of Calverton came into the mean little inn room as though it answered to her, which it did, because everything did. She was holding the small cup. She had brought it, and she did the thing Bea had never once seen her do. She crossed the room, and she set the cup down on the rough deal table at Bea's elbow, in Bea's reach, the finest thing the woman owned placed on the worst table in the county. And beside it, she laid a folded paper. "I have written to my son," the Dowager said. "I left it open for you to read, because you, of all people, will not believe a thing reported. Read it." Bea picked up the paper. Her hands were not steady. She did not try to make them steady. She had no cup-holding left in her. She unfolded it and read the Dowager's flawless hand, and one line of it went into her like cold water, and then like something warmer. "I engaged Miss Allenby to disgust you out of a love match, and instead, she has shown me, at 61, the love match I murdered at 19. And I find I would rather have a clerk's grandchildren than be right for another 40 years. I was wrong, Gabriel. Not in November. Wrong at 19, and every year since. Marry her. I will sign whatever settlement restores her people their roof, and I will hold my own cup, henceforth, by myself." "You're giving him up," said Bea. "The cure, the wall, the whole... You spent 40 years building it." "I spent 40 years guarding ashes," said the Dowager. "I am tired, Miss Allenby. I should like, before I die, to be found out by one person and survive it. You found me out in a fortnight. You said it in this very... no, in my own library, that I meant it about myself. No one has ever read me. I have made very sure of it. And you read me in a fortnight over a cup. And I have decided that being read is not, after all, the end of the world. It is only the end of the world I built. There may be another." She straightened, and the Duchess came back into her like a tide returning, but a kinder one. "He has been at the crossroads since dawn, by the way. He rode through the night. He has asked every coachman in the county which road you took. He is, at this moment, 3 doors down, being told by the innkeeper that there is no Miss Allenby here, because I instructed the innkeeper to say so until I had finished. I have finished. Shall I send him the truth, or shall I send him away? I have spent my life sending the truth away. I find I have lost the taste for it. But it is your road, Miss Allenby. I have only ever borrowed it. B looked at the small cup on the rough table and the open letter in her shaking hands, and she thought of a girl in Norwich learning 30 things a day so her hands would not shame her, and a clerk with good eyes who would have kept her poor and happy, and a banknote folded in a drawer for 18 days unspent, and a duke who had stopped and had been waiting for her to notice, and whom she had read wrong in a doorway out of a terror 40 years older than she was. "Send him the truth," said B. "I find I've lost the taste for the other thing as well. It seems to run in the women your son chooses." And then, because she could not help it, because the engine of her would not switch off even now, "And take your cup back, your grace. I won't have it. A woman ought to drink out of her own." The dowager picked up the small cup. At the door she paused and looked back, and for the first and only time in their acquaintance, she smiled. Not the social Latin, not the masterpiece, but something rusty and real, and 19 years old. "My son was right about one thing," she said. "You are the most uncomfortable thing that has ever happened to this family. I find I cannot do without it either." And she went out, and a moment later there were boots in the corridor, running, not assembled, not charming, simply running. And the door came open without a knock, and the Duke of Calverton stood in it, filling the frame the way he had filled the first doorway she ever saw him in, except that there was no smile anywhere on him, and no charm, and no warmth held out to anyone. Only the whole tired, undefended length of him. Coat soaked dark with rain, hair wet, breath still ragged from the road. Looking at her as though she were the only fire in a cold house. "You walked out of the assembly," he said, "before I could say a single word. You decided what I thought. You, who hears everything. You heard my mother's joke and decided it was mine. You read me wrong, Beatrice. The one time. You read everyone in England right, and you read me wrong. And you ran down a dark road in your good dress, because you were so certain I would discard you, that you saved me the trouble of not." "Yes," said B. Her voice was not steady. She let it not be steady. "I did exactly that. I am very good at being right, Gabriel, and I am very bad at being safe. And when the two collided, I chose the one I had practiced. I have read people accurately my whole life, so that none of them could surprise me into hoping. And then I hoped, and it terrified me. And I read you wrong on purpose, because a discarded poison is a story I know how to live in, and a loved one is not." He crossed the room. He did not stop at a respectful distance. He took her face in his hands, the width of them, the warm, rough palms of them. She had catalogued the width of them weeks ago in a warm library and pretended she was being scientific. And his thumb brushed the cold tear track on her cheek, and he said, low, "Then let me say the word you walked out before I could say. I am not going to be clever. You have ruined me for clever. I cannot eat it. You taught me that. Beatrice Allenby, I love you. Not the poison my mother bought, and not the candidate she paraded, and not any version I made up in a library. You, the one who told me to stop, the one who feeds the goat, the one who is right and lets no one buy it from her with a mason. I have stopped, and I have been stopped since the first afternoon, and I should like to spend the rest of my life being told, daily, exactly what is wrong with me, by the only person who has ever bothered to find out what is right." He drew a breath. "Marry me. Not anyway, not despite. Marry me because there has never, in 28 years, been anyone else in the room." And B, who had spent her whole life saying the true thing too soon, said it, at last, exactly on time. "Yes," she said. "On my terms, mind. I keep the goat. I keep my tongue. You recut the motto, properly, with a verb, so that 400 years of your family finally finish their sentence. And you never, ever try to mend my roof as a way of reminding me you can."
You mend it because we are cold.
That is the whole of the difference, Gabriel.
And it is the only settlement I want.
Done, said the Duke.
Every clause. And he was already laughing. The real laugh, the caught-out one. The one she had pulled out of him over seed cake. And she was laughing too, undefended, on the edge of a strange bed at a crossroads inn. The lilac still impossibly in her hair. And somewhere in the corridor, a dowager duchess walked away holding her own cup, by herself, for the first time in 40 years, and found that she could. He recut the motto before the wedding, which was indecently quick. A month, very nearly to the day, from the green room to the church. Fast enough to scandalize 3 counties and delight the 4th. The mason came from York. B gave him the correct Latin, with a verb in it, and stood in the warm spring sun watching him work, the bright chisel ringing on stone, pale dust drifting down through the light and settling fine and gritty on her sleeve, as he cut tenacious of purpose into a complete sentence at last over the long library door. And beside her, the Duke watched her watch it, which was, she had learned, his favourite occupation, and one she had stopped pretending to mind. "It's still a grim thing to carve over a door," she observed. 400 years of your family announcing they will hold to what they have decided. It wants softening. It wants a second line. "Propose one," said the Duke. "You have ruined every other thing in this house. Ruin the motto." B considered the wrong Latin made right, and the warm library behind it where the books lay face up to the light now, and the small cup that had come back to live on the mantel after all, because the dowager had sent it as a wedding gift, with a note that said, "Only a woman ought to drink out of her own, and you are my own now, God help us both." And she thought of all the things a family might carve over its door, if it were braver than grand. "Hold to what you have decided," she said slowly. "But for God's sake, decide it kindly. That's the second line. It won't fit. It hasn't a Latin, and it hasn't the dignity. Leave it. Some things are truer for not being cut in stone." She turned. The lilacs had opened again, a year's worth in a fortnight, the way they did, sweet and uninvited, over the whole impossible life she had nearly run away from, down a dark road. "Gabriel, there is seed cake in the library, and you have not eaten since 6, and you are about to be charming at the mason out of sheer nervous habit. Come and be fed." The goat sends his regards, and a complaint about the grafting, which we shall discuss at length, because I find I have a great deal to say, and the rest of my life in which to say it. And you, fortunately, have nowhere I will let you go. The Duke looked at her in the spring light, and he did not reach for a single pretty thing to say, and that, she had taught him, was how she knew. He took her hand instead, the warm one, pressing it between his cold fingers, the one that had stopped shaking somewhere on the road back from the crossroads, and he kissed the ink-stained knuckles of it, his lips warm against her skin, the way a man kisses a thing he means to keep. And they went in together, out of the green-gold evening, to the warm library, and the seed cake, and the small cup on the mantel. And behind them, over the door, the finished sentence held. "Without sugar," he said at the door, "if you're pouring." "I know how you take it," said B. "I have always known. It is the first thing I learned about you, and the last I'll forget." And she poured it strong, the way he was happier, and would never have asked for, and set it at his elbow, and sat down in the chair that had been moved near the fire for her, a lifetime ago, by a man who could not yet say why. And the lilacs came in at the window, and the rain, somewhere far off and no longer their concern, did not read Debrett's, and never would.